In this video, we're going to add animation controls to the Hydroviewer, which we started in the last video. Your Hydroviewer should look something like this right now. There's going to be a base map visible and a stream layer. There's also going to be some animation controls down here. There's some HTML buttons, a div for the text, and the range slider. But they don't do anything yet. The purpose of this video is going to be adding JavaScript code so that these controls, the buttons, the slider, do things to update the map so that we can create an animation. All right, we'll start by talking about our HTML input for a minute. Everything that we're going to do to control the animation is going to revolve around this range input. This is how we'll keep track of the state for the map. That is, we'll keep track of we'll keep track of what date should be shown, and on the layer, what date should be printed by referring to the value that is contained in this input tag. Currently, it's at 0. That's the default value. And we have a min and max going from 0 to 100. If we go back to the ArcGIS Living Atlas page for the GeoGloWS layer, it says that it covers 6 days and it goes in 3-hour intervals. That's the same as for the forecasted discharge data that comes from the model. So we're going to make ours cover just 5 days. We won't worry about lining up our end date exactly with the 6th day, that is. So we'll need to cover 5 days and 3-hour time intervals. That works out to 40 intervals, 40 time steps or increments. So I need to change my inputs to have a minimum value of 0, and we can have a maximum value of 40. All right, now all the rest of the code that we need to write is going to end up in our Hydroviewer.js JavaScript file. The first thing that we're going to want to do is add some selectors so that we can write code that interacts with our 6 controls. There's the input slider, the div that holds the string, and 4 buttons. And if I go to the HTML, I can see that each of these had an ID assigned to them. In order to select all of them, we'll use the document.getElementById ability of JavaScript to select items out of the DOM. So I'll say const date slider equals documents.getElementById, and then a string of the ID of the element that we want to select. Now I'm going to copy and paste the rest of these so you don't have to watch me type them all. But it's the same procedure. The date slider is document.getElementById, and then the ID of the input tag. For the date string, it's the ID of the string div and the IDs of the 4 buttons. And you'll see that these line up exactly with the IDs of the 4 buttons, the date string div, and the date slider input. Now everything that we do is going to revolve around the value of the slider. We want people to be able to change the slider value manually and use the back and the forward buttons to change the value of the slider. And whenever the slider changes, we want the map to update. But everything revolves around the value on the slider. So let's start by writing some functions that move the slider value forward and backwards. So I'll say const slider forward is an anonymous arrow function. And what we're going to want to do is compare the current value of the slider to the minimum and maximum. We don't want the slider to be below 0 or above 40. So we'll need a quick check to see that if the value is currently less than the maximum, we have room to increment it by 1. If it's at the maximum value, then we'll reset to 0. And similarly, when we're moving the slider backwards, we'll want to make sure that the current value of the slider is above 0 so that there's room to decrease the value by 1. If it's equal to 0, then we'll just reset it to the end of the slider up to value of 40 and let it move down. And we can do that with some if statements. So I'll say if the date slider value is less than the date slider max value, then we will reassign the value to be one more than it's currently at. Date slider dot value is date slider dot value plus 1. Otherwise, the other possibility is that the slider is at its maximum value, in which case we want to reset to 0. So otherwise, the date slider value should be 0. Now, there's some things that we're going to need to change to make this work. If I come over to my browser and I type in date slider dot value, I see that what comes out is a string. It's not an integer or a float or a numeric data type. So anytime that I do comparisons of between the value and the maximum, or I need to add to it, I need to convert these to numbers first for them to work. All right, so I don't need to change this date slider dot value to a number because we're not comparing this or doing any math with this. We're going to assign a numeric value to the value property. And one other simplification we can make is instead of assigning the value back to 0, we can assign it the minimum value that is stored in our minimum equals 0 in the HTML input tag. We don't have to manually type in the 0. So I can say that the date slider value should be the date slider minimum. There's also a way to condense this down into one line if we use what's called a ternary operator. The way a ternary operator works is you have a expression that evaluates to true or false, and then a question mark, and then you get one expression of code or one statement, what to do if the expression that we checked is true, and then a colon, what to do if false. So let's write that out. I'm not going to need to do any new coding. I can just copy and paste. This is what we're checking to see is true or false. The comparison between the current value and the maximum. Then question mark. What did we want to have happen if this evaluates to true? Well, we wanted to run the code that was inside the if curly braces. Otherwise, what to do if it's false? What goes on the other side of the colon? Well, we put in what's on in the curly braces after the else. Then this all fits into one line. I'll comment this all out so that you can refer to it later and still copy it if you need to. But I'm going to simplify my code to just fit on one line. Our code for moving the slider backwards is going to be exactly the same, except that instead of moving or comparing the current value to the maximum, we're going to do all of our comparisons to the minimum value. So instead of, as I was saying, comparing less than the maximum, we'll want to make sure that we're greater than the minimum value, because that would mean we have room to move the slider back by 1. If we're at the minimum value, then we'll reset to the maximum. So we've already changed to compare that we're greater than the minimum, and if that's true, we don't want to move the slider forwards, we want to move it backwards, so subtract 1 from the current value. And otherwise, we don't want to reset to the minimum, we will reset to the maximum value. All right, so now let's test that this works. If I come to my browser and I call the slider backwards function, I'm currently at 0, so this should reset to the maximum value. And it does. Similarly, if I call slider forward, we're currently at the max value, so it should reset to 0. And if I keep calling slider forward, slider moves forward. And if I call slider backwards, the slider moves backwards. Now this is exactly the behavior that we want to have happen when someone calls the forward and backwards buttons. So we can attach some events to these buttons so that when they're clicked, it calls our functions to move the slider forwards or backwards. The way we do that is with the onClick property of the buttons that we selected earlier. OnClick, we want to run a function. And what we want it to do is, for the back button, call the slider backwards function, and for the forwards button, we'll also run an anonymous arrow function. This one moves the slider forward. So let's go check that these work how we want. Oh, I didn't assign this to the onClick event. There we go. Now when I call forwards, I can see that the slider is moving forward, and when I call backwards, the slider moves backwards. Get the same behavior when it's at the start and end of the input, just as when we called the function ourselves in the console. So this is good. We can control the slider. Now we need some code that makes the map update anytime the slider gets changed. And in order to do that, we're going to need to do some calculations on dates. The Esri layer, the map layer, can update itself to match times, not time increments, which is what the slider calculates for us. So let's start doing some code, or writing some code that's going to calculate dates and do that math between time intervals and date time JavaScript objects. Let's make a variable which we'll call current map time, and it's going to be a new date. Now in JavaScript, if I come over here and I make a new date, I can see that it records the day of the week, year, but it also keeps track of the time down to hours, minutes, and seconds, and it's not pictured, but it also shows millisecond precision. And our map layer works beginning at midnight in 3-hour intervals. So on our current map time, we want to reset the hours back to 0. And there's a set UTC hours property, or method that is, on the date objects. So we'll set it back to 0. That takes whatever the current hour is. It could be 1 p.m., 5 p.m., 6 a.m., whatever it is, we're going to bring it back to 0. We're going to do the same thing, current map time dot set the minutes to 0. Same thing for set the UTC seconds to 0. And since this has down to millisecond precision, we also have to call set the milliseconds back to 0. So let's save this, and when I come over here, refresh my code, when I look at current map time, this current map time variable holds the current day, but at midnight on the morning of the current day. The hours have been reset to 0, the minutes and seconds and milliseconds. Now it shows that I'm at 6 p.m., but that's because the browser knows my time zone is in GMT -6, or Mountain Time. So if I add in the offset from UTC, this puts me at midnight on the correct day. Now that I've calculated that as the earliest possible day for the map, I'm going to store a copy of this so I don't have to recalculate it later. So I'll make a const start map time is a new date, which is a copy of the current map time. Similarly, I want to store a copy of the end date time. End map time is a new date. And in this case, we don't want to store the current map time. We want the current map time moved forward by 5 days. And 5 days times 24 hours in a day will advance us. Oh, gotta type in set UTC hours. We're going to set the hours of the current map time to be forward by 5 days worth of hours. Now that we know the beginning and end time and where we're currently at, which is a value of 0, the start time, we want to print that date to the div that holds the string representation of the date. Right now we have placeholder text. Let's overwrite that now that we know the correct date. DateString.innerHTML is the current map time, and we're going to say to UTC string. Save that. Now when I come back over to my browser and refresh, you might notice that instead of printing today, currently for me it's July 21st, it printed 5 days from now. And that's because when we were over here and did current map time that set the hours forward by 5 days, that edited the current map time variable. So we can't actually use the current map time for this first time that we print out the date. We have a couple options. The easiest is we want to print the start map time, or we can reset current map time to be a new date, which is a copy of the start time that we calculated. And then our current map time has now been reset to the earliest available time. It corresponds with what is shown on the map again. Now when we print out to UTC string, it shows Thursday, July 21st, just like it should. All right, now we have our functions to move the slider forwards and backwards. We know the dates that we need. Now we're going to need a function that updates the map. That was our goal. We want the map to reflect what is represented by the slider. So I'm going to make a function that's called update map date. And I'm going to use the arrow function syntax again. This is going to need to do a couple things. We're going to figure out, based on the current value of the slider, what date should the map show. We'll need to do the math between the start date, represented by a value of 0, and then move the slider forward, or move the date forward, to the number of time steps forward represented by the slider value. So let's do that math first. The date that the map should show is current map time, and we're going to copy the start date time again, just for good measure, in case it has been edited in any other places. And then we'll advance the map time, new date, current map time, dot set UTC hours, and the time interval is 3 hours, so we're going to move it forward 3 hours times the number of time steps represented by the slider, and that value is stored as the value property of the date slider, dateslider.value. And as before, anytime we're doing math with the date slider value or comparisons, this returns to us a string, and we can't multiply a string times an integer. So let's convert this to a number. Now we should be able to multiply the numeric value stored in the date slider by 3. Okay, we've done the math. Current map time now stores a JavaScript object that has the correct date time that the map should show. Let's print that out. DateString.innerHTML is the current map time to UTC string, just as we printed before. So let's go test what we have so far. We haven't written the code to update the map itself, but when I run the update map date function, since the slider is at a non-zero value, our code is going to go take the earliest map time and do the math to calculate what it should the map should represent, and print that out to our date string div. And sure enough, it does. If I move the slider again, I run the update map function from my console, the correct date is printed out in this div. So we're making progress. This works. In order to make the map update, the l.esri.dynamic map layer GeoGloWS layer that we created earlier has a convenient property called setTimeRange, which lets us change the time represented by that layer if the dynamic map layer has time components to it. So I'm going to call my GeoGloWS layer variable, and then it has a setTimeRange method, setTimeRange. And since it's a range, it needs a beginning and an end value. The begin value is going to be the current time that we want, current map time, and the end time will always be the end map time. Regardless of what time step you're on, end map time is always the latest possible animation we want the map to represent. All right, so we'll save this, come back to our browser. Now when I move the slider to any other time, I should be able to call the updateMapDate function. And I'll zoom in somewhere that'll make it easier for us to see. When I run this function, the map should update, and it does. I'll move the slider again, call the function manually from the console, and when I press enter, the function updates. You can tell because the size of some of these streams and the coloring is changing. But we don't want people to have to manually move the slider and call the function. We want anytime this slider moves for the map to update itself. That's not something the user should have to manually type in. And thankfully, there is a way for us to do that. The date slider object has an onChange property. And this is we're going to assign a function to it, and anytime the slider gets changed by the user, that we can run whatever function we assign. So I'll make an anonymous function, use the arrow function syntax, and the thing that we want the onChange event to do is call the updateMapDate function. Now when I come back here, I've written code so that whenever this input changes, the map should also change. So I'll zoom in again to India where there's some yellow stream segments. When I move the slider, the map should change, and it does. But when I press the forward button, the slider moves, but the map does not move. And that's because our JavaScript editing the value of the slider does not trigger that onChange event. So what we can do is add additional functions to run when someone clicks on the button. This time we don't want them to just move the slider backwards and forwards, we also want it to update the map. So we'll call the updateMapDate function. All right, let's go back to our browser, refresh, and check where we're at. Now I have the correct date printed out. That's one of our controls working properly. When I manually move the slider somewhere, the map changes. I'll zoom in again so that you can get a better view to prove that it does work. And now when we click the forwards and backwards button, we should get the same effect. As I click the forward button, the map is updating itself to match what is represented by the slider. Similarly, when I press the back button, the map updates itself, and so does the printed out date string. Great, we're most of the way there. Now the only thing we have left to do is make it so that the animation will play continuously. We want this play and stop button to work. We already have most of the code written that we're going to need. We have code to advance the slider forwards and update the map. When we want the animation to play continuously, we want these functions to be called recursively rather than only one time when someone moves the slider or press the button. So I'm going to need a function which I'll call runAnimation. And what this is going to need to do is everything that we did when someone manually clicked the button, but we want it to repeat over and over. So we'll want the slider to move forward by 1. We want the map to update, and then we want to repeat itself over and over. JavaScript has a way for us to do that. It's called setTimeout, and it takes 2 arguments. One is the function that you want to run. In this case, we want to run the same set of steps again, run animation. And the second argument is how long do you want to wait before you run this function. I'm going to choose about 750 milliseconds or 0.75 seconds. You can change this to be slower or faster, but about 0.75 is a good number to start with. Now when I come over back to my browser, if I start the run animation function, I can zoom in. I see that my slider and date is changing and the map is updating, and that's good. That's exactly what we programmed here. When this function gets called, it updates the slider and the map and then calls itself. Where we're stuck is there's no way to stop it anymore. I haven't attached events to the player stop button yet, and there's no way for me to break it. The run animation calls itself for forever. So let's find a way to break our loop. I'm going to make a variable which I'll call animate, and it's going to hold a Boolean value, true or false. And then let's edit run animation and make the first thing that happens is if the animation has been turned off, if animate is false, if not to animate, then exit the function. Don't update the slider again, don't update the map again, and don't recursively call the function. So this is great, except now I can't run animation anymore because animation is always false. When I run this function, animate is false, so the function can't be run. So let's make the controls to decide whether or not the animation should play or stop be controlled by the play and stop buttons. We can do that by attaching more click events to those buttons. Play button on click. What do we want to happen when someone clicks the play button? Well, we want it to turn on the animation. So we're going to run a series of steps, which I'll write with the arrow function syntax. We want to make animate become true, and then start the animation process. Now when I press play, the animation begins. The animate variable is set to true. But now I'm stuck in that same infinite loop. That function will never stop running itself. So that's where we're going to need to write code for the stop button. When someone presses the stop button, what we want to have happen when that's clicked is to run a function. And all we need to do is turn animate off, set animate to false. And then the next time the run animation function tries to recursively call itself and move the slider forward again, it will get stuck and exit the infinite loop because animate has been turned to false. So let's go test this, see if it works how we want. When I press play, it begins that infinite loop of the animation. I can still intervene in the cycle and fast forward, move it forwards and backwards, but the animation proceeds for forever until I press stop. Let's check on the animate variable. Currently it's true. When I press stop, the slider has stopped moving, the map has stopped updating, and animate has been set to false. So that's all of the functionality we need. The play button works, the stop button works, I can move it forwards and backwards, I can manually move the slider. We have all of our map animation working. Last thing I'm going to do is a little bit of code organization. I'm going to move all of our click events to the same section in the code. And I'll add some comments to label what's going on for organization. These are click and change events for the animation HTML controls. This is a function to begin the animation, function to update the map to the date represented by the date slider HTML input. Here's some code to calculate the beginning and ending date for the map layer. I'm going to delete the commented out code here and put these onto one line. And then I'll label these as functions to move the input slider forwards and backwards. And these are, oops, and these are variables to select DOM elements. And that's everything we need. Our animation works. In the next video, we'll worry about having click events so that when we click on layers, we can go get stream flow information.